July 5, 1830, Algiers. French guns face the Kasbah. The Ottoman Regency is exhausted, its treasury thin, its authority fractured. By evening, the tricolour flies over the city. What began with a diplomatic quarrel and a fan strike has become an occupation. Coastal strongpoints fall. Inland, tribes see caravans disrupted, markets shuttered, and officials flee. Algeria crosses overnight from contested province to theatre of conquest. Abdelkader ibn Muhyi al-Din, born May 1807 near Oran, grows up in a household where scholarship and discipline are the rule. He studies Quran, law, logic, mathematics, and history. He learns horsemanship, marksmanship, and restraint. In 1826-27, he travels with his father through Tunis and Cairo en route to Hajj. He observes modern drills, arsenals, and administrative routines under reforming rulers. He returns to a West that is unmoored. Ottoman officers depart, French columns probe, and local magnates calculate how to survive. In late 1832, Western Algerian tribes seek a unifying authority. They turn first to Sheikh Muhyi al-Din. He declines political command and points to his son. Abdelkader accepts, not as a warlord, but as an organizer. His first principles are clear. Isolate the occupier, punish collaboration that embeds foreign rule, and create a professional force whose loyalty is to a polity, not a clan. Volunteers who come for a raid and disperse cannot hold lines or manage logistics. He institutes pay, ranks, drill, reconnaissance, and signals. He sets up councils, tax collection in cash and kind, and simple courts to dampen blood feuds and stabilize trade. French commanders reading the interior as scattered tribes misread the speed of consolidation. Punitive expeditions produce short-term terror and long-term unity against them. Abdelkader's scouts map patrol routes and depots, then time ambushes against isolated units. Prisoners are taken in organized fashion. Columns that expected policing actions meet coordinated resistance that knows the terrain and refuses fixed fronts unless the odds are acceptable. Negotiation and war run in parallel. In Oran, French officers alternately strike and seek truces when supply runs thin or Paris is distracted. Abdelkader uses pauses not to parade, but to recruit smiths, expand powder mills, and standardize shot and barrel dimensions. He issues orders on market days, caravan protection, and the treatment of non-combatants on penalty of fine or flogging. Reinforcing that order, not vengeance, underwrites legitimacy. Reports move up from local deputies to a central diwan. Tallies of grain, powder, and horses are kept in ledgers that matter more than banners. By 1833-34, the Emir's zone controls much of the Oran hinterland, and his bargaining position improves. He accepts recognition where it binds the enemy to boundaries and access points, and he resumes pressure when those terms are violated. His forces avoid sieges that drain resources, preferring to hit moving supply, burn stockpiles meant for garrisons, and disappear. French letters home begin to record a persistent problem. The interior is becoming a state. Near the end of this phase, Abdelkader's corps is defined, a compact professional army, an administrative skeleton capable of collecting, spending, and auditing. A diplomatic posture that treats truces as time to build capacity, and a social message that justice and restraint, not plunder, are the terms of allegiance. The template for scaling this experiment is ready. The question is whether time and space will permit it to harden before a modern imperial counterstroke arrives. If you're following this story and want more rigorously sourced episodes like it, tap like and subscribe. It helps us sustain long-form documentary work. Question: what do you think was the single most decisive early choice? Professionalizing the army, isolating collaborators, or building courts that allowed Abdelkader to turn scattered resistance into a proto-state? October 1837. Western Algeria. A truce fixes practical lines. The coast is largely French. The interior in the west and southwest operates under the emir's authority. Abdelkader treats the pause as a mandate to institutionalize. He divides territory into districts. Each has a khalifa, aides, scribes, and a modest police. Taxation mixes coin with grain and livestock, smoothing shocks in bad harvests. Ledgers require signatures. Weekly reports flow to a central bureau. Corruption is punished. Repeat offenders are exiled from markets, a sanction as real as prison in a trade economy. He makes Tagdem to permanent capital. Forts are repaired, workshops aligned, a rifle shop aims for steady output, cannon foundries are planned with input from foreign craftsmen hired on contract. Powder mills rely on mapped saltpeter sources and sulfur from surveyed veins. He orders decentralized granaries. Each district stores its own grain to hedge against siege and drought. The principle is redundancy. No single warehouse whose fall collapses supply. Grain loans are recorded. Repayment terms accommodate lean years to avoid pushing farmers into banditry. Schools reopen as an arm of state order rather than mere piety. Quranic recitation, basic arithmetic for accounts, and letter writing for petitions and contracts are the core. Judges are told to minimize vendetta by moving disputes into fines and mediated settlements. Caravans are granted safe conducts with posted penalties for infringements. The message is explicit. Sovereignty is proven by predictable justice and secure passage more than by victory parades. Foreign relations are pragmatic. The emir's envoys explain that his authority is inland and that coastal friction will persist unless French garrisons respect agreed lines. He writes in firm, courteous terms to European rulers, positioning himself as a responsible actor whose restraint is policy, not weakness. Inside his zone, he keeps pressure on interior collaborators, arguing that French coastal presence will remain shallow if it cannot recruit durable local allies. French politics, meanwhile, shift. Editorials in Paris decry concessions that leave two-thirds of the landmass beyond coastal reach. A new cohort of officers argues that truces simply buy the emir time to deepen institutions. Forces concentrate in the east. Road building and blockhouses signal a different campaign rhythm. By late 1839, boundary crossings and insults make renewed war a near certainty. Abdelkader convenes a war council. He orders evacuation plans for key workshops. Portable forges are prepared, ledgers and seal presses are copied, sensitive stores are dispersed. He instructs officers to avoid fixed engagements that invite heavy artillery and to preserve the cadre above all. The goal is endurance. Institutions must bend, not break, when contact with the enemy intensifies. What emerges by 1839 is a measurable state, districts with tax registers, courts issuing written rulings, workshops that can repair and produce, stockpiles that tolerate raids without famine. It is not industrial Europe, but it is a polity with capacity and intent. Its durability will be tested by a new strategy from the coast, a mobile, supply-light army willing to live off the land it seeks to subdue. Question: in state building under pressure, which pillar buys the most resilience, redundant food stores, portable industry, or routinized courts, and why? May 1843. The inland plateau. French cavalry crest a rise and sea movement resolve into streets of tents. It is not a camp, it is a capital on the move, the Smala, with numbered thoroughfares, an order of tents for treasury, records, schools and clinics, plus herds, smithies and supply. The emir's field army is away. The Duke of Aumale orders an attack. When the dust clears, thousands are captured, records seized, and flocks driven off. A mobile state has been located and struck. The Smala existed because fixed capitals drew siege. It aligned governance with maneuver. Registers and seal stamps travelled, schools and courts moved, police rotated to keep order. The army screened the moving city. hitting flanks and rear echelons of French columns, breaking bridges, and destroying mills the enemy might use. The strategy leveraged Algeria's depth, deny set-piece battles, force the occupier to chase, and make supply his persistent wound. The French adapted. They mapped likely store sites and began to live off decentralized grain, flipping redundancy into vulnerability. Blockhouses anchored new roads, flying columns rode light, striking granaries and wells. When the Smala was surprised, the loss was not just material, it was a blow to administrative continuity and to the morale of families who had accepted the risks of a traveling city. Abdelkader recalibrated. He shifted further from positional defense to cascading raids. He prioritized cadres who could reconstitute units and files over holding terrain for its own sake. He reinforced rules for prisoner treatment. Captives were to be protected, turned over to proper authorities, and not enslaved or abused. Complaints were investigated, offenders punished. The order served ethics and strategy alike. It preserved bargaining power and international standing, and it limited cycles of reprisal that drain manpower. Regional dynamics added pressure. After clashes on the border and a French naval assault, Morocco accepted terms to deny sanctuary to the Emir. The theatre shrank. French marshals increased pursuit tempo with more men, more maps, and more confidence that grain could be seized inland. The Emir's core strengths, mobility, intelligence, and the will to outlast, remained, but his administrative spine had been wrenched. This phase was attrition in the strict sense, not annihilation, but erosion of stores, of time, of political patience among tribes carrying the cost of endless maneuver. The Emir bet that an empire would tire before a people defending home ground. Paris bet that deeper roads, harder officers, and a harsher supply doctrine would break the pattern that had humiliated earlier columns. The ledger of losses began to tilt. If you value sober, source-heavy history, a like and a subscribe, keep this work visible and fund the next episode. Thank you. Question: was the Smala a strategic masterstroke that extended resistance, or an organizational risk that, once discovered, accelerated collapse? December 23, 1847, 10:45, Sidi Ibrahim. After years of pursuit by larger forces with better maps and a strategy of living off the land, Abdelkader treats with General Lamoricière. Terms: surrender with a pledge that he and his household will be transported to an Islamic city under Ottoman rule. The signature is a calculation that the core, people and faith outlives a phase of arms. Within days he is in Toulon, then under guard inland. Transport does not come. Offers do: a palace in France, an income, a life if he will stay. He refuses. The promise of exile was part of the surrender's integrity. Accepting comfort would turn principle into private gain. Imprisonment becomes routine. He writes on theology, ethics, and governance. He reframes defeat not as fate, but as consequence. Insufficient industry, vulnerable stores, a foe quick to learn. He does not recant resistance, he records its limits. The year 1848 brings revolution to France and a new political order. Years later, under Napoleon III, the calculus changes. Continued detention violates France's own pledge. In 1852, he is released and honored in transit, a paradox that says as much about European politics as about his reputation. He heads east. In Istanbul, then Damascus, he lives as a scholar and community figure. His lessons in the Umayyad Mosque draw crowds. He spends stipends not on a court, but on students and the poor. He writes letters that warn against fanaticism and defend the lives and property of non-Muslims under Islamic protection. The consistency is notable. The man who forbade abuse of prisoners in war now frames civilian protection as law, not sentiment. In 1860, civil conflict in Mount Lebanon spills into Damascus. Mobs threaten Christian quarters. Abdelkader and his household open their doors, sheltering thousands. He organizes escorts, threatens looters, and petitions Ottoman officials to act. The deaths are real, but thousands more live who might not have. Decorations and letters arrive from Istanbul, London, St. Petersburg, Athens, and Washington. The point is not vanity, it is the record that principles voiced in defeat are enacted in peacetime under risk. The remainder of his life is teaching, correspondence, and counsel. He refuses to leverage his name for factional advantage in Algeria from afar. He does not call tribes to new, futile risings. He dies in 1883 in Damascus, buried with respect in the land that received him when force had spent itself. Decades later, his remains are moved to Algiers with state honors, closing a circle between the boy of Gitana, the emir of Mascara, the prisoner of Amboise, and the sage of Damascus. Question: do you read Abdelkader's surrender as a strategic acceptance of limits that preserved moral authority, or as an avoidable capitulation that cost Algeria years of organized resistance? May 23, 1883, War 7 Zoo, Damascus. A life ends. An argument begins about what it meant. Measured narrowly, the emir did not expel an empire. Measured historically, he created a template: unify tribes under law, professionalize force, decentralize supply, and couple battlefield restraint with administrative credibility. That template outlived him. Algerian nationalism in the 20th century inherited his language of sovereignty tied to justice, not just arms, and his insistence that legitimacy is proved by courts, schools, and taxes that work. His humanitarian record shaped how he is remembered outside Algeria. The decree on prisoner protection during the 1830s and his actions in Damascus in 1860 left traces in European and American newspapers and in official correspondence. Admirers named a town in Iowa Al-Qaeda, a small fact with a large implication. The image of a Muslim leader as a disciplined, lawful opponent who protected civilians was legible even to distant publics in an age of caricature. In France, his image is complicated. The man who inflicted defeats on French columns was also the former foe who kept his word, protected captives, and after 1852 was treated as an honorable adversary. Monuments and debates reflect that ambivalence, recognition of courage and principle alongside the history of conquest. In Algeria, his reputation has traversed shifts in ideology because its anchor points, learning, law, unity, and restraint, are broader than a single faction. From a technical perspective, certain lessons stand out. Mobility and intelligence offset numbers, but cannot substitute for industry indefinitely against a modern state. Redundancy in food sustains campaigns but must be shielded from enemy adaptation. Portable administration is possible, but it is fragile and must be planned for discovery. Ethical constraints are not luxuries. They generate real bargaining power, international sympathy, and internal discipline that reduces desertion and atrocity spirals. There is also the question of limits. Abdelkader read when to negotiate, when to strike, when to disperse, and when to stop. He misjudged at times, holding ground too long, trusting truces that were politically doomed in Paris. But he never confused endurance with denial. He governed as if he might win and surrendered as if integrity mattered after loss. That holistic approach is why he is studied not only as a guerrilla, but as a state builder whose offices, ledgers, and edicts matter as much as his cavalry. Memory work continues. Reburial in 1966 in Algiers, scholarly editions of his writings, civic projects invoking his name, and public debates about how to teach colonial history without myth or erasure. The through line is not nostalgia, it is utility, a record of how to build under pressure, command with law, and argue for coexistence without surrendering identity. In a century that often forces communities to choose between dignity and survival, his life insists that the two can be tied, even if victory on the battlefield is denied. Question: when you weigh Abdelkader's legacy, which element feels most relevant today? Professionalized resistance, ethical rules in war, or the linkage he forged between faith, law, and modern statecraft? If you want, I can package this into a teleprompter-friendly script with time codes and breath marks, or add an on-screen sources card.